When we talk about the militarization of space, it's easy to think of it as an abstract, futuristic idea, conjuring images of Star Wars and flashing lasers shot between rocket ships. But military involvement in space is a reality that's already with us.
It would not basically be possible to fight a modern war without using communications technologies, surveillance technologies, and GPS type technologies, among others. This is not something which is going to build peace and stability internationally. This is engaged purely about war fighting. Back in the day, space programs were really only the preserve of very wealthy, very technologically advanced nations, but the costs of putting satellites in orbit have come down dramatically over the past 10-20 years, and all kinds of new commercial players have entered into the market.
People who need to get satellites up there now know that they have this option that any country in the world can now launch satellites through Virgin Orbit.
We've launched and now have active over 1,500 satellites.
Now we're launching satellites at a prodigious rate, and there are tens of thousands, if not more, of satellites up there.
The UK is in a race to become the first country in Europe to develop vertical launch capabilities in order to launch rockets that launch satellites into space.
The tiny Scottish island of Unst, now front and centre of the global space industry.
On our Spacewatch website, we've listed and continue to monitor the sites of proposed and existing military space activities in the UK.
Arms companies like to call themselves aerospace companies, so that gives us a clue as to what's going on here. A lot of the big aerospace companies have technologies which are useful for the space sector. Players like Lockheed Martin, Airbus, BAE Systems, and nowadays new emerging tech companies like Anduril.
You know, the space domain is so critical to everything, not just Anduril does, but the US government does, right? From things like GPS positioning, how our soldiers know where they are, to communications. It's never been more important to protect that space domain in order for Anduril to do what it needs to do on the ground and to support our US warfighters and allies.
So there's very much a grey area, a kind of dual use area where military uses and civil uses overlap, and it's quite difficult to unentangle them.
In Ukraine in March, the world's richest man won the hearts of many by activating his Starlink satellite internet service in the country.
3, 2, 1, and full power.
It's our position that this rapid growth of space military capacities only increases the likelihood of war actually happening in space. As so much of our daily lives has become dependent on space-based infrastructures, this is not a risk we can take.
It's possible to interfere with satellites while they're in orbit. It's possible to interfere with GPS signals so that you don't know where you are while you're on the ground. It's also possible to interfere with satellite communications. You can jam or you can block the signal that comes to or from the satellites. And it's also possible to physically destroy them if you have a high kinetic weapon which is launched from the ground or from another satellite. So these are all ways in which warfare is now beginning to move into the domain of space.
The United States and their allies some time ago announced plans that included the deployment of weapon and in particular strike combat systems in outer space, as well as the use or threat or use of force in outer space, from outer space, and against objects in outer space.
Make no mistake, this is a diplomatic facade that hides Russia's true intentions. The truth is that Russia currently has several conventional anti-satellite weapons already in orbit.
If, for example, an important communications satellite or an important missile early warning satellite was knocked out, if you don't know who's done it or why it's happened, that can be quite an escalatory step, which might lead to all kinds of crises developing out of control. The useful orbits are gradually becoming saturated. And if there is a problem which results in a satellite breaking up, for example, if it falls out of orbit, or if it's hit by an asteroid, or if it's hit by another satellite, then if that breaks up and forms debris, that debris can itself hit other objects and break them up. And what you get is basically a little bit like a radioactive chain reaction. It's something which academically is called the Kessler effect. And it might mean that some orbits in future effectively become unusable because it's not possible to put satellites in them which will survive in the sort of space debris environment.
Potentially dangerous event in low Earth orbit. Astronauts in the International Space Station were forced to take shelter after a defunct Russian satellite broke up into more than 100 pieces of debris.
A Boeing-built communications satellite, Intelsat 33E, has fallen apart in orbit, marking a serious setback for the company. On October 19, 2024, Intelsat reported an anomaly, leading to the satellite's total loss just days later. The U.S. Space Force confirmed the breakup, tracking around 20 pieces of debris, with estimates suggesting up to 57 fragments in total.
So space debris is a big problem, and it's something that the space powers do need to get to grips with. There are a number of treaties governing the use of space. Perhaps the most interesting one is the Outer Space Treaty, which was developed in the 1960s and maybe reflected the ideals of that age. Unfortunately, that treaty was kind of quite aspirational in its terms, rather than sort of very specific in how it would regulate the global commons of space. So there is a need to sort of reinvent it and come up with a new framework for regulating space. In theory, there's nothing to say we couldn't have just a few satellites up there which are shared, but in reality, of course, it's a free-for-all. It's basically a new Wild West out there where the biggest players and the first players to jump on the scene can pretty much do what they want.
We know this issue is complex, but it's our mission to make it as accessible and comprehensible as possible because it affects everyone.
There's a need to come up with a more sensible framework for how we kind of manage space and run it in the future. It needs to be run basically for the benefit of humanity as a whole, rather than big corporations and wealthy billionaires.
We work with communities resisting the development of military space projects on their doorsteps. The militarization of space has so many worrying implications, socially, politically, and certainly environmentally. We push for regulation, accountability, and a halt to the treatment of space as a warfighting domain.
We need to stop militarizing space because it's part of the global military machine and it fuels conflict and arms racing.